First of all, I want to thank Anne-Sophie, Quentin, and Nicola very much for organizing this very interesting and I think very inspiring conference. I feel very happy and privileged to speak here today. So the purpose of my talk today is to discuss a sort of recent development in German theorizing about Bildung, and I'd say recent, like roughly the next sort of the past 10 years. And I will sort of call that development the post-structuralist approach to Bildung. The post-structural approach, as I understand it here, is sort of an attempt to theorize Bildung as a political and emancipatory concept by drawing on the works of, among others, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. My goal in discussing this approach in the context of this conference is threefold. First, I aim to present the approach to those of you who are sort of not familiar with the specific development in German theorizing about Bildung. Second, I want to present a series of arguments against the post-structuralist approach that show why I believe that it ultimately fails. You might now think that these two goals are in a bit of a tension with each other, because you might ask why it is worthwhile hearing about something to then hear that it might not be so important to engage with it. And this brings me to the third purpose of me telling you about the post-structuralist approach to Bildung today, namely that I believe that my critical discussion of this approach would provide valuable insight into how we should theorize Bildung as a critical emancipatory concept today. However, before I introduce the post-structuralist approach and my critique of it, I want to first say some words about Bildung as an emancipatory concept in general. This discussion might be a bit painful for some of you because I will present a very broad brush outline of what I take to be the relation between Bildung and emancipation to get us through history, as it were, to where my actual argument starts to happen. So sort of bear with me through these passages of my talk. So Bildung in its classical formulation in the 18th and 19th century is linked philosophically to emancipation in two main ways. It's firstly linked to an emancipation from nature, and is secondly linked to an emancipation from an oppressive social order. And I will discuss these two aspects now in turn. Bildung implies for most classical theories of Bildung, such as Kant, Hegel, Herbert, or Humboldt, emancipation from nature. These authors conceptualize Bildung, broadly speaking, as a process in which humans become truly human, a process in which humans realize their full potential by developing their cognitive, practical, emotional, and moral faculties. We can understand this process as an emancipation from the animal-like state in which each of us comes into the world. In the course of a process of Bildung, we appropriate parts of humanity's technological and cultural knowledge, and we become part of a society that is able to control outer nature for its material reproduction, and in which we control our inner nature, that is our impulses and desires, in order to live together in what we might call a civilized manner. So the point here is that Bildung implies emancipation from nature in the sense that we overcome, in a sense, our determination by nature and reach a state in which reason instead of natural impulses govern. The second aspect of the relationship of Bildung emancipation, the political emancipation implied in the ideal of Bildung, is admittedly a bit more controversial among the classical theorists of Bildung. However, I believe that one could make the case that almost all of them, at least implicitly, acknowledge some connection between Bildung and political emancipation. Think of, for example, of Kant's dictum, Sapere aude, have the courage to use your own understanding, or think of Hegel's philosophy of freedom. Bildung was conceptualized as aimed at a certain sense of autonomy that would be irreconcilable, at least, with certain forms of arbitrary domination. But not only that, the process of Bildung also requires certain conditions, as, for example, Kant and Humboldt acknowledge, that are not given in all social orders. For example, Kant stresses the importance of a form of freedom of speech for certain developmental processes. As such, Bildung is both in its goal as well as in its condition linked to political emancipation. This connection of Bildung to emancipation, both from nature as well as from certain political conditions, leads us to an interesting systematic question that I will treat in this talk as the core question when it comes to the connection of Bildung and emancipation. This question is, how is Bildung as emancipatory development under conditions of heteronomy possible? In order to explain this a bit further, consider the following. In order for Bildung as a concept to work, one has to answer the question where the human potential to overcome their natural and social determinations comes from. We have to ask, how is it possible for us to master our impulses or go beyond our immediate socialization in a society that might not enable us to become truly human, to realize our full potential? As far as I can tell, two basic strategies have been employed by the classical theorists of Bildung to solve this problem, and this is where it gets very, very broad brush. The first strategy, that we might want to call the transcendental strategy, is mostly associated with the works of Kant and consists in arguing, by virtue of a transcendental argument, for a human potential of freedom that lies beyond the empirical realm. On this account, humans are able to emancipate themselves from the forces of nature as well as from irrational social formations because they are always already free and only have to realize their transcendentally grounded freedom in empirical reality. This strategy, however, famously runs into a crucial problem. This problem consists in mediating the transcendental approach or the transcendental potential for freedom with the empirical reality of dependency and domination. As many thinkers already at the time pointed out, the Kantian approach only gets us so far. It allows us to assume that subjects are able, politically speaking, to free themselves from the shackles of domination, but since this freedom is ultimately grounded in a transcendental realm, this strategy has nothing to say regarding the question how empirically existing subjects could actually realize the freedom that is ascribed to them. When it comes to the possibility of Bildung as an emancipatory process, this leaves us with a paradox. Emancipatory development is both conceivable and inconceivable. The transcendental strategy makes it theoretically conceivable by declaring humans to be free in the abstract, but it also makes it practically inconceivable by making it impossible to bridge, to mediate, the abyss that opened between the free transcendental and the unfree empirical subject. As a result, many authors adopted a second strategy that we might want to call the teleological strategy. In this strategy, the potential of emancipatory development is not located in the subject as some form of faculty, but is found in its interaction with the world itself. The claim is that simply by interacting with the world, or by interacting with the world in a certain way, subjects, and possibly the world, will undergo a process of Bildung that is, they will develop their faculties and emancipate themselves from the shackles of domination. The way to corroborate this claim is to show retrospectively that the engagement with the world indeed leads us to the kind of freedom that was envisioned. On the individual level, we can see Bildungsromane as an attempt to do just that. On the collective level, we can sort of understand Hegel's philosophy of history as such an attempt. This teleological way of thinking about Bildung and determination was explicitly problematized in the 20th century in the works of critical theorists and critical theories of Bildung. Authors like Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno, as well as Heinz-Joachim Heidorn and Gernot Konefke, argued that this trust in history and the world is simply unfounded. More precisely, they claimed that simply or blindly engaging with the world would not lead to development of all human faculties, and certainly not to political emancipation. Rather, they showed how subject development under a heteronomous social order, more precisely under capitalism, leads to integration in that order. Capitalism, so these authors, fosters only the development of those faculties that are marketable, that are required to survive in it. And even insofar it allows for the development of faculties that seem to elude its instrumental logic, it makes sure that these faculties are sterile and cannot be used to challenge the grip it has over individuals. This pessimistic turn in theorizing about Bildung that did away even with the second strategy to deal with the question of the possibility of Bildung as emancipatory development had major implications for the thinking about Bildung as an emancipative concept. If the potential for emancipative development can neither be grounded in a transcendental realm, nor can we sort of trust in some sort of theological development, we need to find a third alternative to avoid sort of a descent into pessimism. This third alternative, most explicitly developed by the proponents of kritische Bildungstheorie like Heidorn and Konefke, consisted in finding the potentials for emancipative development within the existing social order itself. The potential for emancipative development cannot simply be assumed, but has to be shown to exist by virtue of social analysis. As theorists of Bildung, we actually have to go and see what the spaces of possibility for emancipation in our societies are, and how the emancipative process of Bildung might look like that can take place in them. With that, I have finally, and admittedly under great sacrifice of historical accuracy, arrived at what I consider to be the state of the debate today. We can understand the post-structuralist approach as an attempt to answer the question how emancipatory development in a heteronomous social order is possible without drawing on forms of transcendental or teleological argument, and I will sort of now go on to present a solution. Before I do this, I want to split the main research question that I developed here into 3 sub-questions that will help me to structure the following discussion. These questions are: how can the possibility of process of Bildung be justified? So this is a question basically about giving an argument as to why under non-ideal, under heteronomous conditions, Bildung is even possible. Second question, what is the structure of these processes of Bildung? So this is about how we should think about processes of Bildung. What are processes of Bildung? What is their structure? Given the specific spaces of possibility that we identified in social reality. And question 3, what is the politically normative direction of these processes of Bildung? Where are they sort of headed? What is the social order that needs to be reformed here, and what social order would gebildete individuals produce, right? So these are the 3, I think, important questions here. So before I now turn to my outline of the post-structuralist approach to Bildung and its major proponents, Alfred Schäfer and Carsten Bünger, I want to start with a twofold disclaimer. The first part of this disclaimer is that I cannot engage deeply with the connection between post-structuralist theories of Bildung and the theoretical sources like the political ontology of Mouffe and Laclau that they draw on. Because discussing these influences systematically here would simply be a bit too complicated, too convoluted, which would just take too much time, but I'm very happy to say something about that in the Q&A in case any of you are interested. The second disclaimer is that I will try to draw out in the following what I consider the structural weaknesses of the post-structuralist approach. And in order to do that, I will take its proponents at their word. As a result, my account and critique of the post-structuralist approach might therefore sometimes almost come close to being a bit uncharitable. Because I will not explore sort of the options that post-structuralist theorists of Bildung might have to sort of amend their framework on their own terms, because first of all, that's their job to do, and second, that again would sort of take a bit too much time, but I'm also happy to say something about that in the Q&A, sort of about this issue of charitableness here. Okay, so with these two disclaimers out of the way, let's get started with the approach. To maybe give you the whole thing, I think I want to do this now, cool. To maybe give you the whole thing in one sentence so that you know where we headed here, I can say that the post-structuralist approach answers the 3 sub-questions regarding the structure, the possibility, and the normative direction of process of Bildung, as a sort of, by saying that Bildung is a process of continuous disidentification, so structure, that is made possible by the necessary incompleteness of hegemonic subjectivation, possibility, and that is directed towards a state of radical democracy, normative direction. So in order to unpack this, we have to understand first how the post-structuralist approach thinks about subject development in our societies more generally, because remember, the idea here is to develop an account of Bildung that finds the potentialities for emancipatory subject development within the existing heteronomous social order. In order to understand the post-structuralist perspective on subject development, we have to first adjust our terminology a bit and shift our perspective. This shift in perspective means concretely that subject development is not seen as a subject-oriented socio-psychological process, but as a process of discursive construction. Drawing on the already mentioned sources, post-structuralist theorists of Bildung theorize subject formation as identity construction within a symbolic order. Instead of theorizing how certain experiences and the social structures that produce them form the psyche and the habitus of a subject, these theorists focus on the way identities, in particular political identities, are constructed, or as they would say with Mouffe and Laclau, articulated through discursive means. An important twist of this move is that, at least according to Mouffe and Laclau, there is no objectivity of society or subject development beyond these articulations. What this means, roughly speaking, is that I cannot become a conservative in any meaningful sense sort of just by myself. This identity of a conservative has to be, in some sense, be already constructed in a symbolic social order, for example, by delineating it or demarcating it from the identity of a liberal or socialist. So this is sort of the basic theoretical move, and this is sort of the part where I said I cannot go much deeper than that now, that sort of founds the project of post-structuralism in theorizing about Bildung. And I want to take a closer look at the more precise mechanisms of identity construction within current capitalist societies that the post-structuralists identify. I rely for this account of the post-structuralist position mostly on the work of Carsten Bünger, who I take to have developed the most advanced position within the post-structuralist approach. So Bünger argues that we should think about identity formation with Foucault as a process of normalization, that this is a process in which identities are created to conform with existing hegemonic social norms. By conforming to these social norms, the subjects and their behavior become sort of predictable and functional in a hegemonic social order. Bünger further draws on the Butlerian concept of hailing, or sort of the basic, which is basically the Althusser's concept of interpellation, to describe these processes further. The act of hailing means the identification of subjects as something or someone in everyday social interaction. I think we can understand this mechanism in the following way. By being identified by others as an employee, an aspiring academic, or a potential lover, the individual is confronted with an extensive set of social expectations and necessities. These expectations are, according to Bünger, expressions of hegemonic social norms. Nonconformity with the expectations implied by these norms creates costs for the subject that reach from unpleasant to downright unbearable. While, for example, failing to conform to the norm of the networking and enthusiastic young academic might only result in not being taken seriously, failing to act according to the power hierarchy between employer and employee might result in serious material consequences. In other instances, failing to conform to social norms simply implies a breakdown in communication. Being subjectivized by these means, that is by having one's identity formed by the existing hegemonic social norms, means integration in a current hegemonic order and its hierarchies of oppression and domination. Emancipatory development that we are looking for here, therefore, would imply a need to subvert these norms to a certain extent. I will now, again following the sort of structure of these three sub-questions, outline where Bünger, representatives for the post-structuralist approach, find the spaces for possibility of emancipatory development in the context of these mechanisms of hegemonic identity formation. And I will then say something about the structure and the normative orientation of these processes. To start with the possibility of Bildung as emancipatory subject development, Bünger finds the space of possibility in the fact that it is impossible for subjects to ever fully incorporate a hegemonic social norm. And he provides two arguments to back up his claim, one practical and one theoretical. The practical argument is that naturally, and be it only because of lacking ability, subjects will always fall short of societal norms, even where they are most unambiguous. Subjects might strive to be the perfect employees, public speakers, or parents, but they will never succeed in completely embodying these roles. The philosophical argument is that the different identifications of subjects by means of hailing, as employees, lovers, etc., are partly contradictory. They exclude each other and therefore create a situation that Mouffe and Laclau would call overdetermination. It is a situation in which the contradictions between the various identifications preclude a completely coherent identity that would allow complete embodiment by the relevant hegemonic norms. As a result of this necessary failure to fully incorporate identifying social norms, there is always a certain space, a margin of error, so to speak, that enables subject development that does not fully conform to the norm. And it is in this space of possibility that Bünger situates his idea of emancipatory development. To put this succinctly, it is because hegemonic identification can never be fully complete, and because, consequently, there is a certain leeway in our fulfillment of hegemonic social norms, that there is a space of possibility for emancipatory engagement with these norms that is a space or a possibility for Bildung. The question is now, however, how we cash in on this space of possibility in terms of emancipatory subject development. Bünger's answer is a specific attitude. This attitude is one of playful subversion. According to Bünger, subjects engage in emancipatory development when they consciously make use of the space of possibility that the existing social norms leave in order to subvert them. They do so by fulfilling the social norms in unforeseen or unwanted ways, by exaggerating their role performance, or by systematically confusing role expectations. Consider, for example, the case of playing with one's gender identity, in which individuals undermine existing gender norms and establish an emancipatory counter-practice that subverts existing gender expectations. In a similar vein, one could think about confusing social norms in the field of the economy by creating a parodistic version of the self-marketing entrepreneurial self. What makes a certain move in identity formation emancipatory is that it subverts existing hegemonic norms. It is worth noting here, by the way, that this is not a relapse in the transcendental strategy. The actually existing hegemonic norms determine the potential for emancipatory development, as well as the concrete forms emancipation can take, because emancipation always stands in a relation, albeit a relation of subversion, to the hegemonic social norms. This account of the space of possibility for emancipatory subject development has already provided us with an answer to the second question. question regarding the structure of the emancipatory process of Bildung. Bildung means, on the post-structuralist account at least, precisely this practice of subversion of hegemonic social norms to create subversive identities. Bildung therefore appears as a continuous process of disidentification, of a break with hegemonic identities. This then only leaves us with the third question, the question of the normative direction of these processes of subject development. And here's where the post-structuralist approach already gets a little bit fuzzy. The different proponents of the post-structuralist approach proclaim that they see their theory in relation to the ideal of radical democracy that can be found in the works of, I already said it, Claude Lefort, but also Mouffe and Laclau. However, it remains a little unclear how exactly we should understand this connection. The clearest answer to that, again, can be found in the work of Bünger. Drawing on Lefort, Bünger characterizes democracy as a social order in which the constructed nature of identities and the social order itself is made explicit. Since for the post-structuralist there is no such thing as a social order that is not hegemonic, that is sort of not created by power relations of some sort, the most one can do in order to avoid oppressive relationships is to make the alterability and the contingent nature of the social order explicit. While oppressive social orders usually hide their contingency by producing narratives that make it seem as if they rest on some sort of substantive ground, such as divine legitimation, the superiority of one race over others, or something like that, radical democracy makes the fact that its social norms are merely contingent explicit. It is easy to see how the emancipatory development as subversion of hegemonic social norms fits in this picture. The continuous practice of subversion and disidentification are a way to show the contingency of hegemonic social norms. By showing that hegemonic social norms are not set in stone, that they are open for interpretation and alterable, this practice of subversion instates elements of a practice of radical democracy. The process of development of subjects can therefore be seen as a process of the development of the kind of subjects that a radical democracy would require. That is, subjects that are aware of the contingency of social norms and that are willing and able to alter them if need be. In this sense, one can understand the practices of playful subversion to be directed towards a radical democracy. Not done yet, just a little break. Okay. So far, I have outlined the post-structuralist approach and its main tenets. And I've shown that how the post-structuralist approach answers the question of the possibility of emancipatory development by arguing that the generally established practices of subjectivation allow for a space of possibility of subversion of hegemonic social norms. It is in this space that Bildung has a process of disidentification that is normatively directed at radical democracy can take hold. I now want to say a few words about why I don't think this approach to Bildung to be convincing. In order to do so, I will first argue that the post-structuralist approach lacks the resources to properly conceptualize processes of Bildung, and that therefore its arguments both for the possibility as well as the structure of processes of Bildung fail. I will then show that also the normative direction of the post-structuralist theories of Bildung is problematic. As I have shown, Bünger's post-structuralist approach conceptualizes self-determination as subversive practice of disidentification in relation to hegemonic social norms. The approach seems to work well at first glance. It formally solves the problem of finding potentials for emancipatory development in social reality, and it allows us to describe a whole array of practices of self-determination in a variety of social fields. Prime examples, as mentioned, are the play with one's gender identity or maybe the play with one's corporate identity. However, I believe that the post-structuralist account of processes ignores two interrelated aspects of processes of Bildung: their multidimensional materiality on the one hand and their historicity, their Geschichtlichkeit, if you like, on the other. Starting with the materiality of processes of Bildung, the key problem of the post-structuralist approach to Bildung is that it roots in discourse theory, causes it to focus too much on the surface of identity change, and makes it turn a blind eye to what is going underneath. Reading Bünger and other post-structuralist authors, one cannot help getting the impression that the subversive practice of disidentification they endorse is simply a performance that relies on nothing but the decision to put away one identity mask and put on another. In reality, however, the subversive play with social norms, at least insofar it actually subverts and challenges them, requires the overcoming of serious cognitive, emotional, and economical obstacles. To successfully play with one's identity requires a level of self-reflection and conscious awareness of societal standards that cannot be treated as a given. Additionally, there are often serious emotional difficulties involved. Take the example of subverting existing gender norms by dressing or behaving in a certain way. This can be more difficult than the post-structural account makes it seem. It might not only require substantial courage and emotional commitment in order to confront and deal with one's own feelings, but also requires the willingness and the ability to deal with consequences of this practice for one's social life. And even if subjects were cognitively and emotionally in the position to engage in the practice of subversive disidentification, there might still be economical reasons, like the dependence on a job or a career, that make playing with one's identity a risky and difficult business. The post-structuralist approach to Bildung seems to ignore, or at least severely underestimate, the cognitive, emotional, and economic materiality of political practice and consequently subject development, a phenomenon that the political theorist Louise McNay terms social weightlessness in her critique of the ontologies that underlie the post-structural approach, so for example the ontologies of Mouffe and Laclau. The post-structuralist theories seem to assume that identity change can take place easily, ad hoc, and without much difficulty for the subjects. And even if they do not assume this, their theory provides us with only very limited theoretical tools and resources to deal with the multidimensionality of subjectivity and its development. Because the post-structuralist account only conceptualizes Bildung discourse theoretically as a practice of identity change, it ends up becoming a rather voluntarist position. It lacks the socio-theoretical tools to analyze the already mentioned cognitive, emotional, and habitual obstacles to identity change, and therefore overestimates the chances for the possibility of these processes to occur. But the post-structural approach is not only problematic with regard to the possibility of emancipative process of Bildung, it also gets their structure wrong. I call this the inability of the post-structuralist approach to account for what I call the historicity of processes of Bildung, their very nature as developmental processes. In order to understand this point, it is helpful to consider how we normally think about subject development, or as good Hegelians, how we sort of always think about subject development. We normally think that during their life, subjects acquire skills, make experience, and adopt and abandon certain beliefs. Experience shows that in this process, the past is not irrelevant for the present. Past experience shape our reception of new ones and determine the horizon of our thoughts and actions in the present. In other words, over time, a subject puts on layers of past experiences, it becomes the result of its own development. Post-structuralist theories of Bildung have trouble accounting for this historicity of processes of Bildung. The identity change in the practice of playful subversion appear as a series of singular states rather than a unified developmental process. They do not amount to anything. Today's identity formation could eradicate yesterday's without leaving a trace. On the post-structuralist account, identities are always only the result of the last articulation, not the result of an actual material development. The post-structuralists are forced into this position because they have eradicated the central entity to which the sense of memory that is required for the notion of development outlined above could be ascribed, a subject that exists before its discursive articulation. While the human body and the human mind have a memory, discourse, at least as conceptualized by Mouffe and Laclau, does not. As a result, the post-structuralist approach to Bildung fails to grasp the historicity and the resulting materiality of processes of Bildung, and therefore develops a voluntarist approach to the questions of possibility and structure of Bildung as emancipatory development. I now want to address the last sub-question, namely the one regarding the normative direction of processes of Bildung. I said earlier that the normative political goal that the proponents of a post-structuralist approach to Bildung associate with emancipatory development is that of radical democracy. And I said furthermore that this connection is established by associating sort of the continuous practice of disidentification with the explicit nature of the contingency of all social order that is typical for radical democracy. The question is, however, whether this connection is tenable. That is, whether the post-structuralist approach to Bildung can explain how the practice of disidentification can form subjects that could bring about and engage in radical democracy. I said that the main characteristics of radical democracy, according to the post-structural theories of Bildung, is that it makes hegemonic construction, the contingency of every social order, explicit. This implies the constant possibility of critique, of the demand to change social arrangements, since no argument that bases a social order on an unchangeable ground, like a divine will or natural right, can be given. According to the theorists of radical democracy, in this order of explicit contingency, conflicts about social arrangement should be solved in an agonistic rather than antagonistic fashion. So this point is mainly made by Chantal Mouffe. Additionally, all citizens need to subscribe to one interpretation of liberty and equality as the core democratic values, although not all of them have to subscribe to the same one. Radical democracy, therefore, is a specific kind of hegemonic order with certain features that is as an order more desirable than others. If we ask now how the continuous process of disidentification should lead to this emancipatory social order, we can see how the abstract nature of the notion of subversion that the poststructuralists have in mind comes back to haunt them. In themselves, post-structural theories of Bildung provide no account of what makes one way of subverting a hegemonic social norm better than another. Since they are only concerned with subversion as such, they do not care to think about the specific ways a hegemonic norm can realistically be subverted, and in what relation these specific ways stand to the goal of reaching a hegemonic order that fulfills the characteristics of radical democracy. This problem is exacerbated when tied to the lack of materiality and historicity in the post-structuralist understanding of process of Bildung I argued for earlier. Since there is no notion of a stable subject that acquires certain abilities and attitudes, like the commitment to liberty, equality, and contingency, or the will to engage agonistically in politics, the notion of a subject that would be able to participate in radical democracy makes no real sense in the first place. This, however, means that the post-structuralist approach to Bildung is unable to connect the possibility of a one-time act of subversion to the goal of radical democracy as a hegemonic social order in a meaningful way. Short of claiming that subversion as such brings radical democracy into existence, post-structuralist theorists of Bildung simply cannot really explain how the possibility of emancipatory process of development is related to the possibility of realization of radical democracy. My past remarks should have cast doubt on the post-structuralist approach to questions of Bildung as emancipatory subject development. I want to stress again that I did not elaborate on the possibilities to amend the post-structuralist approach in order to deal with the problems I pointed out. I think there is some potential here. For example, I believe that one could utilize Foucault's theory of power to formulate a more developed account of the normative direction of emancipatory process of subject development. However, I think that the general criticism I outlined here will hold up and pose problems to even more elaborate versions of the post-structuralist approach. I now want to conclude my talk by drawing a couple of very quick conclusions from my critique of the post-structuralist approach. Following the general structure I outlined here, I will address each of the three sub-questions regarding the possibility, the structure, and the normative direction, or normative orientation of Bildung as emancipatory development in turn. No, not in turn. I will address them, but together. The first point I want to make concerns the question of possibility, as well as the question of sort of the structure of possible emancipatory process of development. The point is that I sort of believe that a theory of Bildung needs to conceptualize the process of Bildung as in its materiality and its historicity. That means that we have to theorize the various dimensions of subjectivity, such as cognitive abilities, beliefs, knowledge, emotional constitution, and habitual practices, in order to understand what is at stake in the process of Bildung. More precisely, when it comes to Bildung as an emancipatory process, we need to understand the obstacles in the way of emancipation in relation to this holistic understanding of subjectivity. Acknowledging the historicity of process of Bildung, on the other hand, means to understand the way subjectivities are formed over time and the ways past experience and formations limit and enable future developments. In terms of resources, I think that the developmental aspects of Hegel's philosophy, in particular the philosophy of spirit, can be very helpful here. The second point I want to make concerns the question of possibility as well as the question of normative orientation of processes of emancipatory development. I believe that we should hold on to the notion of emancipation as subversion of existing social structures. However, possibility, structure, and direction of the subversion have to be conceptualized differently in comparison to the post-structuralist approach. Firstly, the possibility of process of emancipatory development needs to be determined by means of sociological analysis and factoring in the multidimensional account of subjectivity. that I sort of just spoke about, tried to outline a little bit. Secondly, the determination of what is subversion and what is integration needs to be done based on an analysis of power. Subversion would be the overcoming of oppressive structures of power or developments that enable such an overcoming. Thereby, subversion is not defined by the act of non-compliance with existing social structures, but is concretely judged regarding the question whether it produces a form of subjectivity that could help overcome certain structures of power. The third and last point I want to make follows almost directly from the second point. I believe that our thinking about Bildung as an emancipatory process should more seriously consider the question of how emancipatory processes of development generate agency, not only on the individual, but also on the collective level. If we take seriously the notion I outlined at the beginning of this talk, that Bildung implies a commitment to political emancipation, we have to think about how becoming gebildet in this sense does not only help us to escape a heteronomous social order individually, which I don't even think is really possible, but how individual development factors into collective emancipative agency. For example, we should think about how Bildung leads to relevant skills to organize, to work together, to change our societies for the better. Yeah. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.